Now, another member of Labour's cabinet has doubled down on support for this blockade, and it's Emily Thornberry, aka the Shadow Attorney General, who was the former Shadow Foreign Secretary who was pushing for a UN report on Palestine to be recognised. Now, Thornberry's changed her tack since because she was on Wednesday's edition of Newsnight and was asked by presenter Victoria Derbyshire whether the blockade was against international law. Here's what Emily Thornberry said.
But I mean, I don't know.
They've already cut off the food.
I hear what you're saying, but what I'm saying
is that against international law? It's really simple. Sir Keir Starmer doesn't seem to think it is.
What is simple is that whatever actions are taken by a democracy, it has to be done in accordance with international law. And we have heard tonight from the President of the United States that he has been on the phone to Netanyahu, and both of them have agreed that democracies need to act in accordance with international law.
Pause there, if I may. Do you think cutting off food, water and electricity is within international law?
I think that Israel has an absolute right to defend itself against terrorism.
That's not the question I asked.
It is an answer to the question that you've asked, and I think it's an appropriate one at this time.
Why won't you answer whether you think it's in line with international law or not?
Because I've tried to answer, and I've tried to say that we've already heard from your previous guest about what might be happening on a day-to-day basis. So we're now on day 4. And so we hear that there are troops massing on the border. There may well be an incursion. Immediately before an incursion, then, as the permanent representative have said, that it might be appropriate in those circumstances for there to be the sort of action that we've heard about. And then the invasion afterwards. I don't know, because at the moment we're in the middle of a hot war, and Israel is in the middle of defending itself. And we have to stand with Israel, just like we would expect people to stand with us if we were the victims of terrorism as well.
Painful to watch that round the Hansel's ramble, which obviously is not an answer to Victoria Derbyshire's question of whether the blockade is against international humanitarian law, because that question requires a simple yes or no answer. And we already have one of those. In 2020, the UN's Special Rapporteur to the Palestinian occupied territories published a report on Israel's ongoing blockade. That report clearly stated that the blockade qualified as collective punishment and was, indeed, against international law. From the report, the extent of the devastating impact of Israel's collective punishment policy can be most strikingly seen in its ongoing 13-year-old closure of Gaza, which now suffers from a completely collapsed economy, devastated infrastructure, and a barely functioning social service system. While Israel's justification for imposing the closure on Gaza was to contain Hamas and ensure Israel's security, the actual impact of the closure has been the destruction of Gaza's economy, causing immeasurable suffering to its 2 million inhabitants. Collective punishment has been clearly forbidden under international humanitarian law through Article 33 of the 4th Geneva Convention. No exceptions are permitted. So in 2020, the UN said Israel's blockade was in breach of international law. Now that blockade has been stepped up, so it hasn't de-escalated, it hasn't decreased, it has been stepped up. And yet, 2 former top human rights lawyers do not seem to be able to recognise that that might still violate the very legislation that, in the same breath, they say needs to be upheld during these hostilities. Now, some of Labour's activists are not happy about Starmer's comments. Ali Milani is a former Labour candidate and sits on the National Executive Committee of Labour Muslim Network. He spoke to LBC about Starmer's stance.
It shouldn't take someone to be an expert in international law to know that the starving of 2.2 million people, half of whom are children, of water, of power, of food, power to hospitals, is inhumane and it's wrong. And I'm really sorry that my Labour leader was sat in a chair next to you and he endorsed this activity. Collective punishment under international law is a war crime. And so we were desperately disappointed. And the only thing I can think of is that my leader either misspoke, in which case he should apologize, retract his comments and clarify his position, or, and I'm really sorry to say this, he doesn't see the humanity in Palestinian lives.
Labour Muslim Network have also released a statement calling for Starmer to retract his LBC comments and apologise. It reads, Sir Keir Starmer's comments on LBC today endorse plans for the collective punishment of 2.2 million people in the Gaza Strip. collective punishment is a war crime. Cutting off power and water to hospitals and life-serving facilities is a war crime. No government, no army, and no country can ever be above international law. We ask you directly, Sir Keir, retract your comments, apologise to Palestinians, and meet urgently with Palestinian organisations in the UK, Labour Muslim Network, and the Muslim Council of Britain. Helena, if the UN can recognise the blockade as collective punishment, and, Shadow Foreign Secretary iteration of Emily Thornberry can, why can't current 2023 Shadow Attorney General Emily Thornberry and Sir Keir Starmer recognise it as collective punishment?
The thing about Labour currently is you have to view everything through the lens of their driving message behind everything they do, their reasoning is about getting elected at all costs. And we've seen the level to which that they will let their morals, they will let their principles completely lie by the wayside in pursuit of that very specific goal of getting elected. And given the current media landscape we have, the current rhetoric we have around what the Labour Party is like, consistently they have been not just, obviously, we had the period in where there was the investigation over anti-Semitism within the party. People can have whatever opinions they want on that specifically. But there is obviously still, to this day, a level to which members of the Labour front bench will continually be asked, well, you were there. You were there trying to make Jeremy Corbyn Prime Minister at a time at which there was perceived anti-Semitism and recorded cases of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party as well. So they know full well that even if their moral scruples would push them towards condemning such actions as war crimes, they know that once they put one foot out of line, suddenly the media can then bring up the fact that there was a time in which they were trying to get somebody who said, quote unquote, our friends at Hamas into the office of Prime Minister in this country. And so they are too scared of the media, they're too scared of the narrative that could be drawn around any potential recognition of war crimes as being as such, given that we know full well that they know these are war crimes, given their background as in their vocations, they must know. So it's a clear decision from them to ensure that they can leapfrog the media in beating these accusations by completely discarding all of their moral principles. And you've got to think whether somebody like that who can put aside their moral principles just to get elected is someone who you think that you can vote for. I would also like to point out as well, there is certain electoral consequences, however. It's not all entirely going to be electorally positive for Labour to abandon in such clear terms the plight of the Palestinians against explicit war crimes from the government of Israel, the state of Israel itself. And that is that there is a large proportion of the Labour voting base who are Muslims. And the issue of Palestine, along with things like, for example, Kashmir, these are large issues, large voting issues for a population base, a demographic base that Labour has relied on electorally for a very, very long time. We have already seen that we have evidence already of the potential for this to leave Labour in a position where they're going to start losing votes in the next election. When we saw the Batley and Spen by-election, where there was the Workers' Party of Great Britain, led by George Galloway, attacking Labour by trying to appeal to disillusioned Muslim Labour voters over the party's changing stance on Palestine and Kashmir, etc., then they got 20% of the vote, over 20% of the vote in that by-election as what is essentially a new party. They very rarely stand candidates from the Workers' Party of Great Britain, who are taking not only a pro-Palestine approach to politicking to win over these voters from the Muslim community, they've also taken a stance against things like trans rights, which is scary for me personally if they start becoming a major force in electoral politics. So it's not without consequence them abandoning this long-held position of the party that kept a huge demographic on side. And I do worry about the potential that has, not just for electoral consequences, but for civil consequences as well.
We obviously have reached out to Labour for clarification on the party's stance on collective punishment. We're yet to hear a response. But I just wanted to pick up on what you said there, Helena. Obviously, Labour is seeking to be the next government. Keir Starmer is likely to be the next leader of the UK. Emily Thornberry, if she stays in her post, will be the UK's most powerful lawyer. Yet both seem to have endorsed an unambiguous war crime. You obviously can't pick and choose when war crimes are allowed, depending on who it happens to. The brutal massacre of civilians by Hamas was a war crime. The blockade and bombardment of Gaza is also a war crime. You talked a bit about the electoral consequence of this, but you've got Tories attacking the European Convention of Human Rights on one hand. You've got Labour bigwigs who seem to be, completely ignoring international human rights law, depending on who they're allied with. As I saw one person suggest, is this the end of a post-war consensus on human rights?
I mean, I would have to say kind of what consensus? It seems to be a very loose consensus up to this point, insofar as our recognition of human rights only goes so far as recognizing the human rights of allies of the West and completely ignoring the plight of those who aren't our allies, or indeed ignoring human rights violations of those who are our geopolitical allies, for example. There's been plenty of times in which, you can take Palestine as an example. There've been ongoing human rights violations. It gets very little coverage. It's been given kind of tacit support by so much of our media and political class for so long that to the idea that there was a grand consensus that appealed in all cases is clearly not true. It's not true. I mean, how long has the blockade lasted? And there's been only very small sections of society that have seen this issue for such a long time. In fact, it almost certainly shows just how pertinent an issue it was, given the situation that has arisen over the last week. Now, there are plenty of other issues in which we have been a little bit more happy to call out our allies. So you take, for example, Mozambique and Guantanamo. But then again, how many times were we also committing human rights violations insofar as the war on terror being used as a justification for these things being temporarily upended? As long as you can find a geopolitical cause in which it's necessary for these things to suddenly be given the green light to be ignored, there's always going to be even further ability for Western countries to be able to further that narrative. Our ally in the United States, for example, was very happy to give up people's human rights. And how many times was this called out by the UK government? Very, very little. We were selling weapons to Saudi Arabia and whilst they were violating the human rights of people during the war in Yemen. Turkey was continually ignoring human rights, so much so that the European Convention on Human Rights the European Court of Human Rights, called out these human rights violations in Kurdistan, in Turkey, and yet they're still a member of NATO, and we still turn a blind eye to these things, at least on a national scale, very often. So I find that given what we've seen about the attitude to people dying in the Channel, or asylum seekers being treated poorly, and our history with regards to geopolitical conflicts in the West, to me, it seems like a very loose consensus which only applies in very certain cases.